Good afternoon. My name is Matt Huang. I teach a Human Rights Center, Suzhou University. This is the second time I had the privilege of interviewing my friend, Dr. Liang Jiaen, my good friend for a long year and my colleague. And as I say in my first interview, he had been doing some fascinating study in Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. And in our first interview, we primarily talked about his background, his family, where he studied, and what kind of research and teaching, what kind of research he did in or on Malaysia and Singapore. And then later we kind of branch out and talk a little bit about his research on Indonesia. I would like to propose we begin this afternoon by asking him to say a few more words of his research on Indonesia and East Timor. East Timor was his first research project. He wrote his MA thesis on East Timor.
Actually, it was my PhD thesis.
Oh yes, his PhD thesis on East Timor. So begin by tell us a little bit of your research on Indonesia and East Timor, and then we can go from there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thanks again for having me. So we're back here again. So I'm just going to talk a little bit, not so much, I'm going to speak in a reversed order, because the thing is, my fascination with East Timor first began when I was doing my second master's at the University of Essex, the Human Rights Center there, in which I kind of got interested in the whole issue pertaining to genocide. And so even though my thesis at that time at the University of Essex was primarily looking at the Human Rights Commission in Malaysia, I still had this very deep impression left on me when I was spending a lot of time looking at genocide, and of course the question of genocide then expanded into my work when I was doing my PhD at the National University of Singapore's Southeast Asian Studies Department. And so from there I had a couple of questions that I was trying to deal with in terms of my PhD research. One of them was that given the fact that the Indonesian army had occupied East Timor for at least 24 to 25 years, what was kind of like the consequence, right, that occurred immediately after the East Timorese overwhelmingly decided that they wanted to have an independent country of their own. And then there was also a period of time as well where the Indonesian army left behind a kind of situation where it was a scorched earth policy that they carried out. And so a lot of the infrastructure, and even in terms of the human relations between East Timorese themselves, were kind of broken apart by that period of violence. So my PhD thesis, my project, was looking at how these communities of people within East Timor itself kind of came together and reconciled with each other. It began by me looking specifically at the East Timorese Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Perception. But then it kind of expanded after that, because as I ventured further out into places further away from the capital of Dili, right, I began to see that a lot of the kind of dynamics that were going on were something deeper. It's something deeper, and the effects had been ongoing even way before the events of what had happened immediately after the East Timorese voted for independence. So that was a very interesting period in time in which I kind of, my research kind of grew, it kind of took wing, and after completing my PhD, I also began to think about the kinds of the violent legacy that was left behind by the Indonesians on East Timor. So I began to ask, right, so if we look at the kinds of things that happened in East Timor, the patterns of violence that occurred is very similar to what we found in Indonesia as well. So Indonesia and East Timor shared similar patterns of violence. So as I looked away from East Timor, and as my research began to gravitate more towards Indonesia, right, I began to do a lot more investigation and research as to the reasons why Indonesia, especially in terms of reference to the incidents of 1965, right, why Indonesia had not yet been able to reconcile with that particular part of the history. Now, this was a part of the history where approximately 500,000 to 1 million people had been disappeared, incarcerated, put in jails, and this was primarily based on allegations that these people were dissidents or members of the Communist Party of Indonesia. As far as I'm concerned, I wanted to investigate to see whether this was actually a genocide, as certain scholars have stated. And so that work took me to Indonesia, where I then began to engage with a lot of people who were former political detainees, and also with activists and NGOs and groups of people who wanted to a certain extent, to dig up that part of history again. And so that was also where I encountered stories of hauntings, of ghosts and whatnot. And it was through my investigation of these stories of hauntings or whatever that I was also able to discover mass graves in which a lot of these former dissidents and a lot of these former alleged members of the Communist Party were thrown into, were murdered and then were thrown into. And so that became a big part of my project for the past couple of years, in terms of me trying to, together with some of my colleagues in Indonesia, in searching for these mass graves, in investigating these mass graves, and also more importantly, in terms of how people remembered this particular part of Indonesia's history through these stories and through these graves.
Well, I appreciate that when you say that this logic of your research project from East Timor to Indonesia, that I don't know if I should use the word, it's kind of that kind of come, if I could use the word, come kind of naturally. But explain to me, or when you say that they share the same kind or same type of violence, I would pause here, because from what we know, and of course we don't know much, from what we know that on the surface that East Timor had been occupied by Indonesia. It was a fight, it was a struggle for political independence. And that is not quite the kind of struggle that is going on within Indonesia. Within Indonesia, what you have is that these three or whatever faction or three political forces, the army, the nationalist army, the religious group, and the Communist Party competing for the control in the country. So they are not fighting for independence. That has been done. They are fighting for in control of the country and to decide where the country should move. Am I right, or please?
Yes, historically speaking, both situations in these countries are very dissimilar, but what I was talking about in terms of the similarities are the structures of violence that existed in both these countries. So we have the Indonesians, of course, they have their own unique history. They have their own unique history in terms of doing away with colonialism, In fact, one of the really interesting things that I found, right, was that, and from what I read as well, is that a lot of the East Timorese, well, at least a lot of the younger ones, right, who were educated during Indonesian times got inspiration from the fact that the Indonesian history that they were reading was also a history of Indonesia freeing itself from Dutch colonialism. So a lot of the younger activists, a lot of the younger East Timorese found inspiration in that. But what I also found very similar is that in Indonesia itself, because during the Suharto years, right, there was a structure of security, there was a structure of control that was put in place in Indonesia. And this very similar structure of control was also exacted over the East Timorese. And so to that extent, right, if we want to find similarities, we can both say that the Indonesian populace and the East Timorese populace were backed by the military.
Yes, good. You are thinking about the struggle for political independence by Indonesian nationalists against the Dutch colonists. Now, it makes sense if I suggest saying that if we are talking about structure of violence, could I say, and if I'm mistaken, please, could I say that it applies to many other Asian countries as well?
Yes.
Okay. So it's not only Indonesia and East Timor. It will appear to me that in so many cases that the oppression, the mass killing, the propaganda, the myth would appear to be fairly similar, almost in all these authoritarian countries. Am I?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Good.
When I work on, in terms of the themes that I work on, right, there's a universal application. The questions that I ask, right, can be applied to many different places and not just Indonesia and East Timor. So in terms of the themes I work on, right, and in terms of the universality of how these themes can be applied, right, is that I look primarily at not just structures of violence, right, but also something much larger as well. I'm so fascinated by something called memory studies. Because if we look at a lot of Southeast Asian countries, if we look at the region itself, right, there seems to be this inability of a lot of these countries to be able to talk about a lot of things. So there's a lot of taboo topics that states tend to skirt around, or there's a lot of taboo topics in which states then harness or use a lot of time in terms of trying to cover up to that extent. In so far that the national narratives that they create, right, has this huge gap in terms of how they look at their history, that they kind of jump over it. And so when in terms of looking at these themes and in terms of putting these themes within the ambit of something called memory studies, right, I find that memory studies has a really kind of, it's a really, really useful tool, right? It's a wonderful tool that we can use to investigate and to uncover a lot of these hidden narratives that a lot of regimes within Southeast Asia tend to kind of gloss over and to hide.
Yes, I sense that. I sense you will be led there, or you'll be driven there in either way. And I kind of course I don't know, but I cannot anticipate that in the next few years, probably this will be the subject matter of your concern in your research. Now, let me turn to, just as we had in our discussion of Singapore and Malaysia, let's turn to the idea or the movement, the struggle for a more open society, a more democratic society. Do you think East Timor after independence, and not really such sacrifice has been made just to achieve political independence? How are they doing now? Are they more stable? Are they more open? And are they more democratic? And so in Indonesia, Indonesia, of course, is a much more complicated kind of situation. But is the situation more stable? And we heard that the Indonesian economy is picking up. They are doing much better. And are they more open? Are they more taking to the idea of rule of law? Because almost all report, either from United States Department of State or from Amnesty International, that in Indonesia that we are still confronted with situation of kidnapping, of killing, of torture, and of course that the prejudice against women. So how you read the situation
in Indonesia? Okay. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about East Timor first. East Timor just quite recently had its presidential elections, and Jose Ramos Horta was voted in. And this is the really, really strange thing about East Timor, right? Is because they tend to have, whenever we look at the presidential candidates, they tend to be the same people. So these are the older generation, right, of leaders in East Timor continue to hold the helm of leadership in this country. And this, we're talking about a really young country with a population of a few million. It's a small country as well. It's half of the island of Timor, right? The western part belonging to Indonesia. So it would seem, right, that the same people continue to hold the reins of leadership. So I think there really needs to be some kind of level of change. Because if we look at the population of East Timor, right, East Timorese it's a young country, right? It's a country with a lot of younger people. But as far as stability and political stability is concerned, I think if we look at East Timor, it's one of the more successful democracies within Southeast Asia. It's one of the more stable democracies within Southeast Asia because institutionally speaking, people vote, people listen, the candidates adhere to the rules and the regulations, and the winner usually is, whoever becomes the winner is usually accepted passively by everyone in a peaceful way. And this is very different from the situation that I saw ongoing, at least when it was in 2006, when the military was fighting with the police, and then when different leaders were, there were different factions within different political parties, and there was a lot more violence going on. But East Timor right now is a lot more stable than what I saw it a long time ago, back in 2006. I think the only other problem right now is because East Timor is kind of perched in a situation where it's a small country, it's a young country, but it also is heavily dependent on oil as a form of as a form of income. So there's a lot of problems that they have to face in terms of dealing with their bigger neighbor further down south called Australia, who's been constantly in dispute with them over who owns how much of that particular part of the sea, of which is very, very rich in terms of mineral resources, especially oil. If we look at Indonesia right now, right? Indonesia is I would consider it to be one of the more stable democracies within the region. One of the recent controversies that have occurred in Indonesia is that the current president, Joko Widodo, was actually thinking of extending his term for the third time. But what he didn't, there were rumors that he was going to do that, right? He explicitly said many, many times that he would not do so, and that there had been demonstrations and protests against that. So I think to that extent, right, he is there is not going to be a possibility of him revising the constitution to allow him to take on a third term as the president. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Jokowi, for whatever it is, right, is nevertheless he's a Democrat. So I think he's going to stick to the rules of the game. One of the worrying things, or at least one of the things that I pay attention to, is the possibility that there could be another candidate possibly coming up and possibly trying again for either the third time or the fourth time, if I'm not mistaken, Prabowo Subianto. Prabowo Subianto has a checkered background, in that he was the is the son-in-law of the former dictator Suharto. He was involved in the special forces a long time ago. He was accused of committing certain crimes against humanity, and also he was accused of having held the president hostage at one point in time, especially when Abdul Rahman Wahid was the president. So there's a possibility, there's that danger there, because this personality who's very much associated with the new order, which is the regime, which Suharto's regime was named, coming back into the picture and kind of fitting into this pattern right now, which seems to be quite popular in Southeast Asia, where a lot of scholars would refer to it as a democratic regression. Right. Democratic regression to the extent where people associated with a former dictatorship or with a former authoritarian regime are coming back into Southeast Asia again. So that's kind of worrying. But I also think, and this is also another very interesting thing when you look at Indonesian politics, right, is that whenever we talk about Indonesian politics, you cannot ignore Islam, or you cannot ignore Islamism in Indonesia. And so it's not just one. When we look at what's going to be happening in 2024, with the next presidential elections, right? It's not just a matter of looking at the particular candidates, but also to look at how Islamic politics in Indonesia at that point in time is going to play out. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge for Prabowo, because he has to pick the right person, or even the next candidate, or the next few candidates for that matter, are going to have to pick the right people in terms of Islamic parties and Islamic politicians in order to balance out, right, the role that Islam has to play in Indonesia. It's going to be really interesting, because Islam in Indonesia is very independent. Unlike in Malaysia, where the religion itself is very tightly bound to the state, right? Mm-hmm. Islam has more space in Indonesia, and it is in fact, right, it can be seen as being a part of civil society. So in that sense, right, there's a big challenge for whoever it is, whether it's Prabowo or maybe even the governor of Central Java at this time, Ganjar Pranowo. It's going to be a challenge for them in terms of them standing as a candidate and choosing properly, or choosing very carefully who's going to be running again.
Yes, so he's still around. I'm referring to the son-in-law of Suharto.
Yes.
For me, of course, I don't know that much. He is really bad news. I was in Indonesia in 1998, just when Suharto was about to fall, and we had a delegation from Taiwan going to Indonesia for the purpose of to help, if that's the word, the ethnic Chinese community, knowing that they have been under severe pressure. They have been very poorly treated, as you know. And we picked up right away. As soon as we got there, it was so tense. The situation was so tense that many of the ethnic Chinese people dare not come to visit us, not until the dark of the night. And the news we pick up is that this man was plotting something, probably like he was aiming a coup d'etat of some kind. So for me, he is a bad news. He is a bad news. Now, I think let's move into the ethnic, since I inadvertently refer to 1998 and the ethnic Chinese community in Indonesia. Now they always occupy a very special position. That they have been discriminated against, or you can put it differently, that they prove to be very difficult to be assimilated. So, what you think is the situation now through all these years, in particular since World War II, that are they more, are many of them more assimilated, take out the citizenship, take out the nationality, or what is the situation?
I think if we look specifically at Indonesia and Malaysia, the thing that I'm usually more concerned with, right, it's not so much assimilation, but the amount of space, or the amount of political space that ethnic minorities in either Indonesia or Malaysia are given. And when I talk about ethnic minorities, I'm not just talking about specifically to referring to ethnic Chinese and all that. But in Malaysia, even when we talk about people who are in minority religions, or even, for instance, Malaysian Indians for that matter.
Yes.
But if we look specifically at the Malaysian Chinese, or in a lot of these other ethnic minorities, that there's been a greater opening in terms of post-1998 at least. There's been a greater space for a lot of these ethnic minority groups to be engaged with politically. So, given that they have the space to engage more politically, right, they are also given a lot more prominence. And so, in that sense, right, these ethnic minorities are not so much living within their silos, as it were, before, but rather they're now becoming more proactive, and they're being seen as being part of the system. So I guess to a certain extent, that's a good thing. But ethnic relations are always, I wouldn't say it's tense at this point in time, but there are instances, right, if it fits a particular political agenda of a particular political party, right, they will definitely raise up some of these issues and push up some of these issues. But I'm glad in the sense that because there are, again, we have certain political parties or certain political groups, especially within Malaysia, that are always trying. I think the easiest way for any political party in Malaysia, right, to kind of grab attention, right, is to say that, oh, okay, we're going to defend this particular race, we're going to defend this particular religion. That's the best way, and it's the easiest way for a lot of these political parties in Malaysia and even in Indonesia to say that, oh, we are going to protect your interest in that sense. But I think there's also a growth in terms of how activist certain institutions can be. And in terms of Malaysia, I'm talking about how when we talk about the role of the monarchy. I think the role of the monarchy in Malaysia is that it is evolving to that extent, right, in which it sees that it is the protector not only of the interest of the majority of the people within the country, but rather also of the interest of the minorities within this country. So I guess from what I see, right, we are beginning to have this kind of traditional conservative institution that has, of course, its own interests, but also has the capacity, or has said that it wants to have the capacity to protect the interest of everybody and not just of one specific ethnic group. In Indonesia, it is, from what I can see also, is that there has been an outgrowth of different political groups coming forth also, right, that represent the interests or stand on a platform where they say, okay, we're going to now, we represent all Indonesians and not just people of one specific group. So to that extent, right, whilst that tension is always there, or whilst that kind of, you know, how a lot of political parties capitalize on the ethnic factor, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia and Malaysia, there are, on the other hand, right, institutions and a growing space that allows ethnic minorities to be more vocal in terms of demanding their rights and demanding that space that they should be given after all.
Right. Now, I think for me, I think I would be quite pleased to see that happening. That is not longer emphasize a specific ethnic group, because, but I still think that the ethnic Chinese certainly have been so closely tied to this society and to the process of how, to the process of their nation building process, if you will, in Malaysia, in Singapore, and in Indonesia. To what degree that they are different, because they have such a long historical background, because they moved to Southeast Asia, like in the 19th century, if not earlier. And then, in part because that the Chinese government would not let them go. So that here, China would not let, you can put it from what we have been talking about, probably you can put it that way, saying that the Chinese government would not let the ethnic Chinese community break free. They want to hold them, so they are part of our larger family.
Right.
Okay, and this poses problem as I see. And so that I would like to hear your comment, the role of China through the decades. I say the role of China in the nation building process, and in so many of the riot, the racial riot, the national riot, not the ethnic Chinese community and the Chinese government were involved, so that what is your reading of what is your take, what will be coming next? Now at this point we are talking about this, United States and China are competing so intensely for the support of Southeast Asia nation. In this competition, certainly that the ethnicity of all these different groups, I think implicitly or explicitly play some part in that. So what is your comment?
Traditionally speaking, the Chinese presence in Southeast Asia is both physical, and that there has been hundreds of years of migration going back and forth between the two places, and of course the intensification of people coming over from the southern parts of China because of colonial policies, because of how the colonial powers wanted to encourage more people to work the colonial economy. But I think historically speaking, also in terms of China, its relationship with Southeast Asia, is that for a lot of the nationalist movements in Southeast Asia, they were very inspired by the the Shanghai Revolution in 1911. They were also very influenced by, the Shanghai Revolution influenced a lot of the early nationalists in Southeast Asia. So that's part one. And then we've got part two, which is where China at that point in time then becomes communist in 1949. From the stuff that I've read, from the kind of things that I've done research on, a lot of young ethnic Chinese were very fired up by the fact that you have now this new revolutionary form, this new China that has these communist principles that a lot of young people found really, really attractive. But in terms of state-to-state relation, the fact that the Chinese government was part of the larger communist bloc together with Soviet Russia, right? China was seen as a threat, right? Because we were also having our instances where, the incident in 1965, and then in Malaysia and in Singapore, it was basically the state found China to be a threat because China was contributing to internal chaos in these countries, as China was seen to be fomenting communist movements. Right? So now as we move into the 80s and move into the 90s, right, China has now become the kind of economic superpower that it is. That strangely enough, even in Malaysia for me, a long time ago, just as recent as maybe 20, 30 years ago, the Malaysian passport would state very clearly that I can't go to China. But now the strange thing is everybody can watch CCTV or Chinese state television on Malaysian cable TV right now. And that's a strange thing, right? Well, but it's not really that strange because, of course, the situation in China has entirely changed. And so it's seen as a global economic powerhouse. It is contributing to major infrastructural programs all throughout Southeast Asia, trains, planes, automobiles, ports, all that kind of stuff. And so to that extent, right, they are seen as a viable economic partner. And ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia are seen as that bridge between China and, of course, their own native Southeast Asian countries. But one of the problems, and this is the thing, I think that China is not doing correctly in that on one hand, it is emphasizing its soft power and it's reaching out to, and it knows that it has an audience to reach out to, especially in terms of ethnic Southeast Asia, ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, they are also acting in a sense, in a very aggressive way. And I mean, you can see it in terms of that kind of conflict that they have with a lot of other Southeast Asian countries that claim sovereignty over little islands located all throughout the South China Sea. So there's that conflict on one hand, and then there's the Chinese government or the Chinese state trying to sell economic cooperation and friendlier ties and cultural ties with Malaysia. So this is the thing that doesn't jive, all right? Whilst they are putting so much time and effort into investing in Malaysia, at the same time they're also sending fleets of planes, coming very close to the airspace in Malaysia, especially in Sabah. And that is something I think which confuses a lot of Southeast Asian countries. Should we trust them or should we not? Of course, in terms of economics, fine, great. But then they also tend to be very aggressive, and this is the problem because if the Chinese are not able to find that balance, it will also to a certain extent affect the relationship, the ethnic relationship between ethnic Chinese people in Southeast Asian countries and everybody and all these other ethnic groups there. Because there's a possibility that again, right, we'll go back to that problem that we saw during the Cold War, in which the Chinese might again be stigmatized, right, as a fifth column, as people who you can't really trust. So this is something I think that the Chinese government needs to really tread very carefully on.
I think you put it very well, and I've been struck by these kind of contradictions. Do you anticipate that after a period of time that the political elite in China, sitting in Beijing, would learn how to use your word, to balance these two approach to these two way of dealing with Southeast Asia?
I hope. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know what's going on behind the minds of a lot of these Chinese leaders. I hope they will be able to find the balance. But from what I see in terms of the current leadership in China right now, it's a leadership that is very assertive, right? And when we read about things like wolf warrior diplomacy and all that, I mean, this is really aggressive. Well, I mean, even if they say, oh, our aggression is only meant towards specific countries, like for instance, maybe the US, but the way in which they act, the way in which, at least from what I see, right, is a resurgent China who is intent on that kind of narrative to show the world that this is our age, this is our century. It can make things dangerous in that particular part of the world, in Southeast Asia, because from what I see, right, a lot of Southeast Asian countries are only now beginning to find some kind of balance or some kind of meaning in the sense of what their identity is. Right. I mean, the whole period of nationalism in Southeast Asia, I mean, it started out, if we look at the history of a lot of Southeast Asian countries, right, we were born in instances of extreme oppression and violence.
Yes.
Right? So the period, the immediate post-independence kind of time frame, right, was a time frame that was used to create as much stability as possible, given our experiences. So now, 50, 60 years later, right, it's only now that we're beginning to come to some kind of realization or come to some kind of acceptance of who it is we are.
Right. And then, put it very well.
Yeah.
More relaxed, maybe a little bit.
Well, I wouldn't say relaxed, but at least we've come to accept certain things. And at least, even for a lot of ethnic Chinese people, even younger ethnic Chinese people, right, they're beginning to accept the fact that, this is where we were born, and this is who we are, and this is probably where we're gonna die, right?
Okay.
But it is also at the same time, right, that you have a resurgent China, right, who's trying to push, right, push all the way down south, and then trying to say that, hey, this is where you belong and all that. That's
right. Doesn't sit very well.
No, it doesn't sit very well. So it's almost as if we're going back to Cold War times again.
Right. Now, quite a few scholars, in particularly if they are of the political realist school, tend to predict that a war between United States and China is inevitable. Like I said, the very well-known professor from University of Chicago, John Sherman. Do you agree? Do you think that the United States and China will go to war either over a country over South China Sea, as you refer to all these different claims to sovereignty, to sovereign right, to historical right, or over Taiwan?
I sure as hell hope not. Nobody's going to go to war over Taiwan.
Okay.
But it's I think America is on the downtrend. I think with the recent Biden administration, it's beginning to realize that, that the period of Pax Americana is over, and that it's kind of fortress and America is overstretching itself, and so it begins to recede. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have this resurgent power, right, that is trying to, and that's the other thing, because as one country begins to kind of shrink to that extent, right, to realize that it's overstretching itself, that it wants to kind of recede for a little bit and work on perhaps its internal economics or its internal politics. I'm kind of worried about the other factor that is at play here, because it would, and I'm referring to China again, right? In that it is, I feel that there is also this sense of paranoia, right? I think sometimes, right, it is inherent in Chinese thinking, right, that they need Taiwan as a counterfoil, right? That's how Chinese nationalism asserts itself, by constantly using Taiwan, right, as the what do you call that, the scapegoat, if you want to use it, constantly using Taiwan as the battering boy, right? As the whipping boy to kind of assert its own identity. And that's the thing I'm kind of worried about, because I think to a certain extent China also suffers from a kind of sense of paranoia, in that it believes that the whole world is against it. And that's what I always say, right? In terms of its strategic interest, right, it tries to build the pearl of strings kind of strategy, in that it tries to protect itself, right? I mean, of course, I can understand, right, that a lot of times, at least when we look at American overtures, right, it can be quite aggressive, if not more aggressive than what the Chinese are doing. And to a certain extent, if you take into consideration, if you just take the Chinese perspective, right, what they're doing is basically, maybe to that extent, right, they're just protecting themselves. Because they're so dependent on South China Sea, they're so dependent on trade, they're so dependent on ships being able to travel freely through to all over to, I mean, freely travel through the South China Sea. And so that's why you have, of course, the Belt Road Initiative. So in a sense, right, you have a power that is receding, trying its best to survive, and you have a power that is paranoid and constantly tries to reassert itself. So whether the US and China are going to war at any point in time, I would hope not, because I think, right, I think to a certain extent China and the US are still what I refer to as rational actors, as opposed to Russia,
Okay.
which is a totally different story altogether. So I think these two countries, or at least China, is trying to act as rationally as possible, because it's too inbuilt into the global system. Trade, right? Its dependence on on countries outside for its survival, and also I think to a certain extent it also understands that a lot of countries are also dependent on it in terms of their own survival. So it's a little bit more inbuilt into the global system. So to say that they want to go to war, there's always that possibility, because they are also to a certain extent paranoid. But I think when compared to Russia, they're a little bit more rational.
Okay.
And that's me being really optimistic.
Okay. Now let me push you a little bit, just that when you say very light-hearted, that no one would go to war over Taiwan, I think many scholars, and not to speak of the government in Taiwan, will jump on you. They are going to take you to task. How are you going to defend yourself? They will say, we are so important, Taiwan is so important. Of course, the Western world, the Western power will go to war to defend Taiwan. And is it not that in the past year or two that Biden and his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense have been repeating that almost on a daily basis? So how are you going to educate yourself? I would say.
I think on one level, right, China has been saying that it has been wanting to attack Taiwan for a long time. and America has been saying that whether it will actually attack Taiwan is one thing, and America has been saying for a long time that it will defend Taiwan, and whether it will defend Taiwan also is again another thing. So I think Taiwan right now is in a very tight spot. But I think to that extent, right, Taiwan has also done a lot of things which I think are right in that I teach a class called public diplomacy, right? And I keep on, and one of the things that I tell my students all the time in class, right, is that visibility is the key to survival. So what Taiwan has been doing over this past few decades, right, especially in terms of public diplomacy, right, is that, and where it has done really well, right, is to constantly keep itself as visible as possible. Which is why, right, we have the World Health Association situation going on, and the really intense campaigns that Taiwan has been pushing, right, signing on to the ICCPR, ICACR, and the 3 other international human rights covenants, coming up with taglines like Taiwan can help, sending masks and all that, sending out vaccines, even though these vaccines are not recognized. It's in that sense, it's doing well. It's also making it very obvious that it's a very important part of the global supply chain, right? Especially when it's one of the biggest suppliers of semiconductors to the world. So in that sense, right, you can find similarities with how Singapore carries out its foreign policy, right? Its diplomacy. It's the same thing. It's a small country in a rough neighborhood. So it makes itself a part of the rules-based international order. I think the term that is used quite a lot also, right, is the porcupine strategy.
Yes.
I mean, porcupine is one thing, but I think Taiwan is also kind of similar in Singapore in that it's trying to push for to show the fact that it's a very important part of the international community, even though the rest of the international community doesn't recognize it as a state. It's doing a good job in trying to show that it continues to exist. It's just that sometimes, right, you have people working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs thinking in a particular way, operating in a particular way, and then on the other hand, you have people in the Ministry of Defense thinking in a particular way and looking at things in a particular way. And the same thing goes for China as well. You might have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs trying to use put as much effort into diplomacy as much as possible, but you have no idea what the People's Liberation Army or what the big wigs in the PLA are thinking about. And that's the problem sometimes.
Okay, I think let's end up this interview. This interview has been going on about almost 1 and 10 minutes. By asking you this, you are research, what plan you have for your research project in the next few years, and you are teaching what you have in mind?
Okay. The teaching is probably going to be still the same. So I tend to put a little bit more emphasis on the class that I teach on human rights. I also intend to be opening up a class on transitional justice at some point in time, probably in the next year or so. So that's going to be really interesting for me. I'm also hoping to open up a class on human rights and film, which is going to be a general education course.
Very good.
For
we have been doing some of that here
yeah.
at Suzhou University.
Yes, I've taken inspiration from that actually.
I see. Very good, very good, very good.
In terms of my current research, right, in the next couple of months or so, in the next couple of years, I am hoping to be looking at the situation with the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. There is so-called war on drugs, and then there's an effort now in the Philippines where they're trying to exhume bodies of those who were supposedly executed by unknown gunmen because they were drug pushers and all that kind of stuff. So I'm hoping to be going over there soon to look at human remains.
I anticipate that Philippines should be in your map.
Yeah, definitely. And then after that, maybe Sri Lanka as well. But for now.
All right, let's conclude on this now. We wish you the best, and thank you so very much for a superb dialogue. Your superb discourse on Southeast Asia and beyond. China, United States. Thank you. Thank you.